security compliance in the cloud. As you know me, I'm visually and I've been working with Royal Cyber as a solutions architect, and I've helped numerous customers in their cloud journeys. And while I do see the importance of cloud and the benefits that it brings, it's also important to consider uh, the challenges around how to stay compliant, right? And that's something that we will address in this short talk today. So this is going to be our agenda for the day. What we're going to do is we're going to look at what compliance is, what are some of the risks and challenges that it poses, and then how you can address those risks and challenges by using certain tools, right, and frameworks. And then we'll finish off with a customer case study. So, as mentioned, I'm from Royal Cyber, and we're a consulting firm, and we are working with numerous customers around the globe in the domains of digital transformation and e-commerce. Um, as you can see some of the stats here, we've been in the industry for more than 20 years, and we have more than 2,000 people working with different customers, and we have offices throughout the globe. All right, so what is compliance, right? So in today's fast-paced world, it's very easy to adopt the cloud, and more businesses are taking their applications to the cloud. But it's also important to keep your applications and data secure, right? So this is where something like compliance can help. What compliance is basically a process to make sure that you're adhering to a certain set of standards, rules, and policies set by governments or by certain groups that allow you to operate in a certain industry, right? So that's basically what we mean by compliance. So you adhere to a certain set of legal and regulatory industry standards. Now, when we talk about these industry standards, there are some standards in place which are related to certain industries or governments. We're going to just take a quick look at some of those. Like, for example, we have the PCI DSS standard, which is the payment card industry's DSS standard. And it applies to those organizations who are basically accepting credit card transactions and handling credit card data. So it ensures it has controls in place to make sure that that data is kept secure and safe. So if you want to be operating in an industry, running an e-commerce site, for example, then you need to be PCI compliant in order to process those payments. Similarly, we have the HIPAA, framework that applies to all the organizations that are working in the healthcare space, because this one deals with patient data, so PHI or patient health information, right? So it also has safeguards in place to ensure that data is kept secure, and transmission of data is secure. So what could happen if compliance were to be ignored, right? What could go wrong, right? So one of the biggest things that can go wrong is that you can incur a lot of financial penalties, right? If you ignore compliance, and that results in a data breach of some kind, and customer information is stolen. That can result in a lot of financial penalties depending on the type of industry that you're working in, right? And this can cause a significant damage to your reputation to conduct business in that space, and it will cause some difficulties for you to conduct business, because let's say if you lose your certification to operate in a certain industry, then it might be difficult to get back. That certification also earned the customer trust, right? And let's say in the event of like a data breach or customer information is stolen, that can also result in legal liability, right? Loss of sensitive data. So we compiled some stats around some of the industries, what's happening in this industry these days related to compliance, right? So what we found was like more and more organizations are storing data in the cloud, and they're more and more concerned about how to manage that data as it pertains to keeping compliant, right? And an average cost of a data breach could be upwards of $4 million, right? We see these data breaches happening, on a frequent basis. Like in 2017, there was a credit card bureau that had a data breach. related to a version of Apache Struts, and that compromised the data of 150 million plus customers, right? And all their sensitive information was stolen, like social security numbers and addresses and date of birth. So, and that resulted in like heavy fines and penalties for that organization. Similarly, there was a breach in 2019 with a bank that resulted in the data breach and loss of information for 100 million plus customers. So these are some things to keep in mind that could happen if potential breach were to happen. And being compliant is something that can prevent you from these things from happening. So we talked about what compliance is and what are some of the risks associated with it, right? So what are some of the challenges that you might run into when you're trying to get compliant according to a certain standard, right? So you keep some things in mind, like there are constantly changing regulations and standards, right? Depending on the type of industry you're working in, let's say, there are daily exploits that are happening, and that might result in more controls being added to the compliance framework. So how do you keep up with that, right? So that could be one of the challenges, right? And how do you just ensure that you have safeguards in place to protect your sensitive data at rest and transit across different environments, right? How do you protect yourself from different cybersecurity attacks? And another important area is that, let's say you're working with a cloud provider, how do you ensure that they are also compliant with the industry that you're operating in? Like, for example, you're working in AWS, and they're offering a multitude of services. And then let's say you're a healthcare customer and you want to use some of the AWS services. You'll probably need to evaluate that service at a standalone level to see whether it's compliant with the industry that you're working in, right? Another thing to keep in mind is something called like the shared responsibility model, right? What happens is, when let's say you're working in the cloud, right? Then when it comes to compliance, the cloud services provider is responsible for the security of the cloud platform, and you as a customer operating in the cloud is responsible for the security in the cloud. So in this diagram, you can see, like, for example, talking about AWS, they're responsible for this bottom half, right? So they are providing you with all the infrastructure to run your applications on. So they are responsible for the security of all these services that you're providing to you. So they're responsible for the security of the cloud. Now, when you as a customer are building your applications on top of this cloud, you need to make sure that you are adhering all the regulations that pertain to your specific industry, like healthcare or finance. So we talked about what compliance is, what are some of the risks related to compliance, what are some of the challenges you might run into. So let's talk a little bit about how do you implement some of the controls around compliance to manage it, right? So here's this compliance framework we talked about. So it has some key components like governance, which is basically a defined set of rules that dictate how a specific organization will operate in the cloud, right? Especially around the areas of asset management, financial controls, and cloud strategy and architecture, right? That needs to be in place, which leads us to change control, right? So it's so easy to get started in cloud and start building applications. That could also be one of its problems, right? How do you manage that sprawl of resources, right? So you need to have guardrails in place and automation in place that allows teams provision resources in the right manner and also decommission those resources. And you also need to monitor all the events that happen in the cloud, right? Because that can help you with determining the audit trail in the case of a security incident, for example. And then you also need to continuously do an assessment of your environment, and you do need to do things like vulnerability analysis and penetration testing. That needs to happen on a continuous basis too, right? And you need to have a reporting framework in place that will help you document the results of all your assessments and audits, which can help you getting formally certified in the industry that you're operating. So this is where we would like to talk about the importance of a CSPM tool, or Cloud Security Posture Management tool, that can help you improve the security posture of your cloud, and that can eventually help you with some of the compliance management as well, right? So a tool like this can do is It can connect to your environments. It can scan all your resources. What it can do is, it has a predefined database of all the security standards, industry-based standards like HIPAA, PCI, and SOC 2. And what's going to do is, it's going to evaluate all your resources against all the controls that are defined as part of those standards, right? So if any resource is not passing those checks, it's going to get flagged in the CSPM tool. It can help you with the remediation of those misconfigurations as well, right? So here I'm just showing some screenshots from our own product. It's called Securacloud, and it's a CSPM tool. And in this first screenshot, you can see that it gives you kind of like a compliance scorecard, right? So it's evaluating all the resources in the cloud against different security, different compliance standards, like in the screenshot, like HIPAA and CIS and PCI, and it gives you like an overall scorecard. And it lets you drill down into each of these frameworks, and then look at what resources are not compliant according to the controls that are defined in these frameworks. So let's take a look at some of those controls. Right? We'll just take a look at 4 or 5 of these controls. For example, encryption, right? So this is part of multiple frameworks, right? And this CSPM tool basically is just showing a specific finding where your disks are not encrypted with encryption key, right? So it basically shows what the finding is, and then at the bottom it shows all the resources that are basically failing this control. So these disks are not encrypted, they're showing up under this control. And it also gives you some options here, like what should you do? It found an unencrypted disk. How can you encrypt it, right? So it can help you, remediate this misconfiguration as well. Similarly, we have a control related logging. So all kinds of logging should already be enabled. So it checks for multiple types of logging, like for your VPCs, VPC flow logs. You've got your storage buckets, so the access logs, application logs. So it checks all kinds of logging, and then basically flags those resources which are not enabled for logging, and then how you can remediate that. And it also checks the area of identity and access management controls. For example, if you're not following the principle of least privilege, and if some of your principals have more super admin access, for example, in this case, right? So we're using those primitive Google roles of owner, editor, or viewer. That resource is going to show up down here. Also, network, right? That's also important. Network security. So it's going to evaluate all your network resources, like your security groups and firewalls. And if it finds any overly permissive rules, it's going to flag those out as here. For example, in this case, we have some firewall rules that are allowing port 22 to be accessed by the public, right? So it shows that here. So one thing that the CSPM tool offers is that it gives you an option to remediate the misconfiguration, right? So let's say you found a misconfigured resource. In this case, it says that a key rotation is not enabled, right? So it gives you the option to remediate that finding. So if you click this blue button, it's going to show you like a step-by-step procedure on how to enable key rotation on a certain resource. Besides this, it will also give you the API and CLI commands that you can issue or incorporate in your automation to remediate this finding. Another benefit of a CSPM tool is that it can give you a complete picture of all of your cloud inventory, right? So let's say you're operating in AWS, GCP, and Azure. You might have multiple accounts. You can connect all of those to the CSPM platform, and it's going to give you a list of all the resources belonging to all the cloud platforms in a single pane of glass, right? And then you can drill down into each resource and see if any resource is failing a compliance check or not, right? And then perform remediation actions on it. So this is what the process could look like to get compliant, right? So you can start with information gathering phase. Basically, you can identify the cloud services, infrastructure, and data sources that will be part of your compliance activity. And then you can define the scope of your assessment, whether you want to limit your scope to a certain area or do you want to just expand it to multiple areas where you want to evaluate yourself. And then you need to identify the stakeholders from your from business teams, the technical teams, legal teams, that will be responsible for the action items that come out of an internal audit, for example. And then once that is done, and all the findings have been documented, these stakeholders can be assigned action items who can work on the remediation, and then eventually you can work towards getting a formal audit done and getting certified. So this brings me to a customer success story. So we were working with a Fortune 500 healthcare customer, and they were having issues with security and compliance. So what we did was we did an initial assessment using the Securacloud tool that I just talked about, and it scanned their environment, flagged all the vulnerabilities and the non-compliance of their resources, and then using that assessment, that report, our teams worked with their teams to develop a plan to remediate those resources. And when all the remediation work was done, it helped them gain back their HIPAA certification and become more compliant according to the industry they were operating in. So Securacloud was kind of instrumental, in helping them to get certified. It made our jobs easier as well to do the initial assessment. So yeah, that's all I had actually to talk about compliance and how it can be managed. Some of the key takeaways from this talk are that what compliance means, what are some of the compliance standards out there in the market today, and how you can implement controls to manage compliance on an ongoing basis, and how a CSPM tool can help and make your job easier in that respect. So as I mentioned, Securacloud is our product, and as part of this event, we would just like to offer a complimentary assessment of your environment using this product to see if you can bring in Securacloud to your workflow and help with your compliance and security needs. Thank you.